I've had fireplace noises on all day, and now that I've just turned them off, my room feels way too quiet. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel and another installation of Webcomic Wednesday. So for those who are new to this series, pretty much what happens is every week I chat about a webcomic I love and give it some love, give it some recommendations, and hopefully you guys can find something that you enjoy and want to check out. So this week's webcomic is Finding Home, which is by Hari Connor. I don't know if it's pronounced Hari or Harry. It's spelled H-A-R-I. I want to say Harry, but I feel like my brain says Hari. So my apologies. I promise one day I will have one of these videos where I pronounce everything properly. What can I tell you about this comic? So let's go over some of the nuts and bolts of this comic first. This comic is available on Tapas, which is where I read it. I believe it's also on Webtoons, which is another fairly common webcomic platform that I don't think I mentioned in my intro video, but I will link those down below. As always, I'm impartial to Tapas and their like infinity scrolling feature. I'm just obsessed with that, and it keeps me up to 2 a.m. way too often. And it updates every Monday, and you usually get about 2 pages at a time. At this point in time, we're almost at the end of the 3rd volume, so there's going to be 4 volumes, and each volume encompasses 3 chapters. So we're almost at the end of chapter 9 in what's available on Tapas and Webtoons. If you have Patreon access, you can get a little bit ahead, which I do, and I would recommend it because I love this comic. So, what is this comic about? This comic follows Chapey. I looked up the pronunciations for characters' names these times, so I believe it's pronounced Chapey and Yannick, and they are 2 people. I feel like I described this the same way in my wrap-up video, but there are 2 people, and essentially what happens is they cross paths in the woods in their journeys, I guess, and Chapey offers to help Yannick get back home to where he's going, since he seems to kind of like know the lay of the land a little bit better, and they end up traveling together on the journey and slowly getting to know each other a little bit better and become friends and hopefully something more. It is a slow burn romance. When I say slow burn, I mean slow burn in every essence of the word. It is also a fantasy comic, as it takes place in this world where there are humans, but there's also nymphs and other kind of fae and these otherworldly beings. I don't know how else to describe that, besides, like, I guess fantasy, just kind of mythological creatures is the best way to describe it, that is built into this world. And yeah, I guess I'll dive into characters because that's kind of where some of the lore gets pulled out. So Chapey is half human, half nymph, and because of this he has vines for hair, and he has the ability to grow flowers and different plants from his hair and his body. And this is one of my favorite things about the comic, because the flowers and plants that he's growing has to do with what his emotions are. So at the beginning of each chapter, they kind of expose you to this new flower that's kind of going to be prevalent for the next part, but the flowers from before always come in, and sometimes you don't know what the flowers are until later on, which is really interesting. I actually went back and reread the comic, or reread a lot of my favorite scenes. The author has a chart that outlines what all the different flowers are that we know of so far, and it is on their Patreon, but it's something that everyone can see that's accessible. And I've like gone through with like a fine-tooth comb and like staring at his hair like, okay, what is this flower? What does it mean? Or like going through these scenes and being like, oh my god, I didn't pick up that that was what was growing from his hair at that point. That was what he's feeling. He's a very reserved person. Chapey himself has gone through a lot of turmoil in his life, which is something I'll get into a little bit more in the plot, but because of that, it leaves him very kind of shut off and angry at the world, and he's slowly trying to learn to like put down those walls, which is something that Yannick tries to bring out in him. Yannick how do I describe him? He's kind of like a teddy bear in some ways. I feel like he's a very lovable character. He was a chef back at home in the inn that he worked in, and essentially he's traveled to find his sister, and then he's on his way back home when the comic is taking place. He's very kind and empathetic and very open as well, and they kind of serve as this like interesting opposition to each other in the way that they kind of help complement the things that they both struggle with, and they learn to open up to one another and be more honest in different and unique ways. Yeah, so I think the biggest difference is that Yannick is a lot more emotionally available and willing to have those conversations than Chepe is. So to get into the plot a little bit more, so Chepe is a healer because that is an ability that the nymphs have. However, he can only heal to a certain limitation without using outside sources because he is only half nymph and he is half human. This is something that is very like interesting to Yannick, and Yannick often like pushes to find out a little bit more about this, but Chepe really tries to like keep these walls up and keep the distance between them. He's faced a lot of adversity in his life because there is a lot of prejudice between the human and the nymph worlds. For example, one of the things that you find out is that Chepe wasn't allowed to go to university because of his background, which is super shitty that they basically just kept him out because they're like, screw you. So there's some really interesting conversations about racism throughout the book, as well as class conversations, because even though he is half nymph, half human, he did come from a privileged family, and he was essentially, prince isn't the right term, but kind of like the heir to kind of the throne of where he's from, and he pretty much walked away from everything because of his frustration with his family and with the world that he was a part of, and he wanted to be able to make more of a difference. One of the key things about the plot is it's a very character-driven story, so it's working on development for both of the characters, but I would argue that Chepe ends up being more of the central character, and because of that we see a lot of the trauma from his past, and one of the biggest things is that Chepe was in a emotionally abusive relationship, so that's something, just content warning wise, there is a lot of talk about emotional abuse, and Chepe kind of uses alcohol as a way to deal with that, and there's also some areas of kind of coercion and forced and dubious consent in his past, so that's also just something else to be wary of. His ex is a piece of garbage. It's really funny to me to like read and just see every time he shows up people are like losing their mind, they're like, screw him. So that's something that is dealt with throughout the book, as well as Chepe also struggles with anxiety, and that's something that he kind of has to face throughout the story. The way that that is written is so well done in the moments that kind of trigger him and how kind of the anxiety takes over him. The way that the scenes are drawn are so well done that you can just feel how overwhelming it is in the moment. And as someone who experiences anxiety, it's probably one of the best representations that I've ever seen, especially looking at the way that lasting trauma with someone who was really important to you or you were in a relationship with, how that can carry on to your future relationships is something else that the comic does really well. The world that they build is also really fascinating in the ways that they create all these different creatures. There's these like wisps that are like trying to get to them at night that are like really ooky spooky and well done, as well as, even though the story is centered on the two of them, all these kind of like secondary characters come together in a really interesting way to bring it all together. Now that we've kind of covered that, why should you read it? Well, number one reason that I've already gone on about is the flowers. I can't get over the flowers enough. It is so like well done, and the attention to detail that goes into the comic is amazing. Another thing that I really love about the comic is that portrayal of anxiety and trauma and everything, and the way that it is done in the art style is fascinating. There are like certain scenes where something is happening in the present, but Chepe is being basically like transported to the past, and the way that the cells are like overlaid, so pretty much like it looks like one smooth picture, but half of him is in the past and half of him is in the present, is so well done, and the symbolism and the meaning behind all of that is amazing. The story does also a really good job of not demonizing either of them, which is something that I really appreciate, because I think it's really easy to brush off someone's behavior because of trauma or something that they've struggled with in the past, and Chepe goes through this journey of realizing maybe he hasn't always been the best friend to Yannick because some of the struggles that he goes through, or some of his upbringing, and learning to kind of try to get to the other side of that, which is really interesting. And then Yannick also learns about the ways that he needs to try and be there a little bit more from Chepe, or be a little bit more open in their communication. Communication is one of the things that's very frustrating about this, because you're like, oh my gosh, please, just the two of you get down in a room together and sort this out. But it seems to take them forever to do that. I don't know what else to say about this comic. I love it so much. It's so pretty. The world that has been created is like so immersive that you really understand everything that's going on. At the beginning and ends of these chapters, there are these letters that Chepe is sending back to Priya, who he's working with, and the emotion that comes across in the communication and everything he's saying is so raw and vivid. And the way the story balances taking times to lean on Chepe and understand what he's feeling, and leaning on Yannick to understand what he's feeling, and how that all comes together to create this narrative and frustration in the reader, where like we know everything that's going on in their minds, but they're not in a place yet where they're ready to create or communicate that, is amazing. I can't recommend it more highly. It is one of my favorites. I would definitely recommend checking it out, and if you enjoy it, please do contribute to the artist's Patreon, because it means a lot for creators. I actually messaged them and they replied to me and were like, thank you so much for letting me know how important this comic was to you. This is something that they had kept in mind when they were making it, and it seemed to mean a lot to them that I shared that with them. So that's something that I always want to keep in mind, is if you appreciate something, let people know, because it honestly makes a big difference. With that being said, if you like this, feel free to subscribe to my channel and ring that bell. If you've read this comic or you have other comic suggestions for me, feel free to leave a comment down below. And besides that, my Goodreads and my art Instagram will be linked down below as well. So this is all that I have for you guys. I will have a new video coming out, I think it's either Friday or Saturday, talking about my reading journey, and then after that I'll see you guys next week for another episode of Webcomic Wednesday.